The Doctor of Clean Hands, Ignaz Semmelweis, and the persecution of a life-saving idea. Ignaz Semmelweis's name is now synonymous with the basic medical practice of hand-washing, but his story is not one of straightforward scientific triumph. It is a tragic, sobering account of how professional pride, rigid scientific dogma, and institutional inertia cost millions of lives and ultimately destroyed the man who tried to save them, cementing his legacy as a poignant symbol of scientific resistance. Part 1: The Shadow of Childbed Fever in 19th-century Vienna, 1840s. The mid-19th century was a paradox in medicine. While great strides were being made in anatomy, pathology, and surgical techniques, the concept of infection remained largely a mystery. Hospitals, often seen as bastions of healing, were frequently places where diseases spread rampantly, turning acts of care into vectors of death. This grim reality was nowhere more tragically evident than in the maternity wards. Our story begins in 1846, at the sprawling and prestigious Vienna General Hospital, Allgemeines Krankenhaus, a leading medical institution in the Austrian Empire. It was here that a young, earnest Hungarian physician named Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis, recently appointed assistant at the first obstetrical clinic, confronted a terrifying epidemic, puerperal fever, commonly known as childbed fever. This devastating illness would strike women shortly after childbirth, manifesting as a raging fever, severe abdominal pain, and overwhelming sepsis, leading to a swift and agonizing death. It was the leading cause of maternal mortality in Europe's hospitals, casting a long shadow over the miracle of birth. Semmelweis was a deeply empathetic and meticulous observer. The statistics he faced were horrifying. The first clinic, where medical students received their practical training, consistently recorded death rates from childbed fever that were astronomically high, often exceeding 10%, and in some harrowing months, reaching an appalling 18% or even 30%. This meant that nearly 1 in 5, or even 1 in 3, women admitted to that ward for the joyous event of childbirth would never leave alive. In stark contrast, the second obstetrical clinic, located in the same hospital but dedicated to the training of midwives, showed a dramatically lower mortality rate, typically hovering around a mere 2 to 3%. This shocking disparity created a chilling reputation for the first clinic. Pregnant women, utterly terrified, would often fall to their knees, begging to be admitted to the midwives' clinic. Some, in desperation, would even choose to give birth on the streets outside the hospital walls, preferring the uncertainty of an unsupervised delivery to the almost certain death awaiting them inside the doctor's ward. Semmelweis vividly recounted witnessing women collapse in tears upon learning they were assigned to the first clinic. He himself, haunted by the ceaseless procession of deaths, described how the sight of a new mother's healthy, smiling face would fill him not with joy, but with dread, knowing that within days, she too might succumb to the invisible killer. For Semmelweis, this profound discrepancy was not merely a statistical anomaly, it was a moral affront and a scientific enigma that demanded a solution. Part 2: The Clues and the Catalyst, 1846 to 1847. Driven by an almost obsessive need to understand and halt the epidemic, Semmelweis embarked on a rigorous, systematic investigation. He was a man of logic and observation, determined to unearth the underlying cause of this inexplicable pattern of death. He meticulously examined every possible variable that could distinguish the two clinics, methodically eliminating one prevailing theory after another. Overcrowding. Both clinics often suffered from similar levels of patient density, so this couldn't be the sole factor. Diet. The patients received the same food. Climate and ventilation. The clinics occupied different wings but were subject to similar environmental conditions within the hospital. Spirituality. One popular belief held that the sight of a priest making his rounds, accompanied by a bell, struck terror into the hearts of the women in the first clinic, weakening them. Semmelweis observed that the priest's route traversed both clinics. To test this, he persuaded the priest to change his route and silence his bell. It made no difference to the death rates. Fear in psychology. While the women in the first clinic were undoubtedly terrified, fear alone could not account for such a high and consistent death rate, nor the immunity of those in the second clinic. Birth positions. Even differences in birthing positions were investigated and discarded as a causal factor. The only remaining, undeniable difference between the two clinics was the personnel and their daily routines. The doctors and medical students in the first clinic frequently moved between the autopsy room, where they dissected cadavers, and the maternity ward, where they examined living patients. The midwives in the second clinic did not perform autopsies. This stark distinction slowly began to crystallize in Semmelweis's mind as the crucial clue. A pivotal and tragic event in March 1847 finally illuminated the path to discovery. His esteemed colleague and close friend, Jacob Kolechka, a professor of forensic medicine, accidentally received a puncture wound to his finger from a student's scalpel during an autopsy. Within days, Kolechka developed a severe illness with symptoms chillingly familiar to Semmelweis: a high fever, chills, rapid pulse, excruciating abdominal pain, and swollen lymph nodes, culminating in a swift and agonizing death. Semmelweis was present at Kolechka's autopsy and was struck by the pathologist's findings: identical internal lesions, inflammation, and widespread abscesses to those he observed in the bodies of the women who died from childbed fever. It was a visceral, horrifying realization. He deduced that Kolechka had died from the same cadaverous particles that were being unwittingly transferred from the morgue to the birthing mothers on the hands of the medical staff. The invisible killer was not a miasma in the air, but something tangible, yet unseen, carried on their very hands. He described these particles as decomposing organic matter, years before anyone understood the concept of microbes. Part 3: The Radical Solution and Its Immediate Success, 1847. With this paradigm-shifting insight, Semmelweis felt an immense surge of urgency and certainty. He theorized that the cadaverous particles, though unseen, were responsible for contaminating the mothers during examination. He needed a method to destroy or remove these particles from the doctor's hands. He experimented with various cleaning agents, eventually settling on chlorinated lime solution, calcium hypochlorite. He chose it not only for its known disinfectant properties but also because he believed its strong, pungent odor would neutralize the putrid smell he associated with the cadaverous particles. In May 1847, Semmelweis issued a revolutionary mandate in the first obstetrical clinic: every doctor, medical student, and staff member was required to thoroughly wash their hands with chlorinated lime solution before examining any pregnant woman. This was not a suggestion, it was a strict order. They were to wash not just for a moment, but until all traces of cadaverous odor were gone. The results were not merely good, they were miraculous. The impact was almost immediate and undeniably dramatic. The mortality rate in the first clinic, which had been a staggering 18.3% in April 1847, plummeted to 2.2% in May, the very first month the hand-washing protocol was fully implemented. By June, it was 1.2%, by July, an astonishing 1.0%, and in some subsequent months, it reached zero. For the entire following year, the death rate in the first clinic consistently rivaled, and sometimes even surpassed, the low rates of the midwives' clinic. The angel of death had been banished. Semmelweis had, through simple observation and empirical evidence, solved a medical mystery that had plagued European hospitals for decades. He had saved countless lives with an intervention that was cheap, accessible, and remarkably effective. His clinic, once a place of dread and despair, was transformed into a place where mothers could give birth safely, truly celebrating the miracle of new life. Part 4: The Wall of Scientific Dogma and Professional Pride, 1848–1860. Despite the undeniable statistical proof and the palpable reduction in deaths, Semmelweis's triumph was short-lived and met not with universal acclaim, but with intense skepticism, hostility, and ultimately, professional persecution. The medical establishment of the time was deeply entrenched in its traditional beliefs and theories, primarily the miasma theory, which posited that diseases were caused by bad air or noxious atmospheric conditions. The concept of invisible disease-causing agents, especially those carried on the hands of esteemed medical professionals, was utterly foreign and deeply offensive. The reasons for this vehement rejection were multifaceted and deeply rooted in the scientific and social context of the era. Assault on professional pride. The most significant barrier was professional ego. Semmelweis's theory implied that doctors themselves, the highly educated and respected healers, were unwittingly responsible for the deaths of their patients. To accept this meant admitting guilt, incompetence, and a fundamental flaw in their practice. This was an unbearable affront to their dignity and status. Many doctors simply refused to believe that their gentlemen's hands could be agents of disease. Lack of theoretical explanation. Semmelweis could only present empirical evidence, the dramatic drop in death rates. He could not, however, explain what these cadaverous particles were. The germ theory of disease, articulated decades later by Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister, was still unknown. Without a scientifically accepted theoretical framework, his critics dismissed his findings as mere coincidence, unproven assertion, or even superstitious practice. Institutional inertia and envy. Change is often met with resistance, especially in established institutions. Many senior physicians resented a junior doctor challenging their long-held practices. Figures like Professor Antonin Hamernik vehemently opposed Semmelweis, mocking his hand-washing delusion. Communication barriers. Semmelweis himself contributed to his own downfall in terms of communication. While brilliant in observation, he was not a polished orator or a skilled political operator. He often expressed his frustration with the continued deaths of mothers by directly accusing his peers of being murderers for failing to adopt his methods. This confrontational style, fueled by his moral outrage, further alienated the very people he needed to convince. He also delayed publishing his findings comprehensively, relying initially on oral presentations and circulars. His mentor, Professor Johann Klein, far from supporting him, viewed Semmelweis's success with suspicion and professional jealousy. Instead of championing his assistant's life-saving work, Klein refused to renew Semmelweis's contract in 1849, effectively expelling him from the Vienna General Hospital. This act marked the beginning of Semmelweis's tragic professional downfall. Part 5, The Tragic Fall and Posthumous Vindication, 1861 present. Exile from Vienna, a disillusioned and increasingly bitter Semmelweis returned to his native Pest, modern-day Budapest, Hungary. There, in 1851, he secured an unpaid, honorary position as chief physician at the maternity ward of St. Rochus Hospital. Undeterred by past rejections, he immediately implemented his hand-washing protocol with chlorinated lime. Once again, the results were astonishingly successful, reducing the mortality rate from childbed fever to consistently low levels, often below 1%. In 1861, after years of urging from colleagues, Semmelweis finally published his magnum opus, Die Etiologie, der Begriff und die Prophylaxis des Kindbettfiebers, the etiology, concept, and prophylaxis of childbed fever. This comprehensive work detailed his observations, statistical evidence, and the logical progression of his discovery. However, the book was met with the same, if not greater, skepticism and hostility as his earlier pronouncements. Critics continued to mock him, demand theoretical proof he couldn't yet provide, and reject the uncomfortable implication of their own culpability. The relentless rejection, the knowledge that mothers continued to die needlessly due to the medical establishment's obstinacy, and the personal attacks took a severe toll on Semmelweis's mental health. His passionate pleas turned into increasingly vitriolic open letters to prominent European obstetricians, in which he lambasted them as irresponsible murderers and called out their ignorance. These letters, while understandable given his deep conviction and desperation, further solidified his image as an unstable and irrational figure. By 1865, Semmelweis's mental state had deteriorated significantly. He exhibited erratic behavior, paranoia, and deep depression. Tragically, in July 1865, he was committed to a mental asylum in Doblain, near Vienna. Just 2 weeks later, on August 13, 1865, Ignaz Semmelweis died. The ultimate and cruelest irony of Semmelweis's life lay in the circumstances of his death. He died from a severe infection, a gangrenous wound on his hand, likely sustained during a surgical procedure or an altercation at the asylum. The symptoms, fever, swelling, blood poisoning, were eerily similar to the very childbed fever he had dedicated his life to eradicating. He fell victim to the invisible enemy he had identified but which his peers refused to acknowledge. Within a few short years after his death, the scientific world underwent a profound revolution. Louis Pasteur's pioneering work on microbiology firmly established the germ theory of disease, and Joseph Lister's advancements in antiseptic surgery provided the undeniable theoretical and practical framework that Semmelweis had lacked. Suddenly, Semmelweis's cadaverous particles had a name: bacteria. His life's work, once ridiculed, was finally recognized as foundational. Today, Ignaz Semmelweis is hailed as the savior of mothers and a pioneer of antiseptic procedures. His tragic story is a powerful cautionary tale, often cited in medical ethics and the philosophy of science, illustrating the immense cost of professional dogmatism, the perils of challenging established authority, and the slow, often painful, path of scientific progress. His simple, yet revolutionary, insistence on clean hands remains a cornerstone of modern medicine, saving countless lives every single day across the globe.